Have a listen to this. While this may sound like it walked straight out of an ABBA record from 1977, it was actually released this year. This is Only for Tonight by Pearl Charles, taken from her newest album Magic Mirror, and it's a track heavily inspired by the sounds of disco from the late 70s. And if you've been keeping up with pop music for the last few years, you'll know that a whole host of artists have been reworking the sensibilities of disco into new music. So how did we get here, and what makes this, the third wave of disco, different to its predecessors? Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Munro, and in today's video we're talking about disco. Disco is one of my favourite genres in the world. I mean, I'm an absolute sucker for all dance music in general, but disco has a particularly special place in my heart. It's just got such a sense of joy, community, and of course, dancing. I spent most of my life looking back to its glory days, so to be living in a time when new disco records are coming out is really exciting. Right now, 2 of the Brit Awards Album of the Year nominations are disco-inspired records, while some of the biggest artists of recent times, such as Lizzo, Doja Cat and Harry Styles, have all released disco-sounding songs. The sound of the genre is really in at the moment, and it's exciting to see how artists are reinterpreting its conventions. Before we get into today's releases, however, let's take a look at the history of the genre to get an understanding of its fundamentals. The culture of disco actually finds its origins a while before the music side of things does. Discotheques were clubs that started out in Europe in the 1950s as nighttime venues to listen to music and dance. In the 60s, some of these began opening up in the United States, playing soul, funk, and go-go music, and they attracted a mix of African American, Latino American, and Italo American communities. These spaces would later also become popular with queer people in the 1970s. As the hippie counterculture peaked towards the end of the 60s, a number of trends from hippie music spaces crossed over to discotheques, these being bright lights, colourful clothing, playing music loudly, and psychedelic drugs. The spaces these influences created in turn helped inform the music that was being played at them. Motown, the definitive funk and soul label in my eyes, produced some of the first discotheque hits, and really inspired the repetitive nature of these songs and their strong bass lines. The orchestral side of disco, namely its lush strings, came primarily from Philadelphia soul artists like the OJs and MFSB. Along with an increase in the visibility of black culture in the 1970s, such as through shows like Soul Train, all of these forces come together in the middle of the decade to form what we now know as disco. Its finishing touch was the pioneering of perhaps its most enduring legacy, the 4-to-the-floor beat. This was a thumping, perfectly suited rhythm, usually at around the 120 BPM mark, though there was plenty of variation in speed, and this drum pattern is what gave disco its innate danceability. Producers like Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers, Cerrone, Ashford and Simpson, and Giorgio Moroder worked with artists such as Diana Ross, Donna Summer, ABBA, the Bee Gees, the Tramps, Earth, Wind and Fire, Sylvester, Sister Sledge, Chic, and so many more, all of whom helped to give us disco's first wave. After becoming oversaturated and receiving a racist reaction from some listeners, disco as a sound dissipated into all manner of other genres at the start of the 80s. Club culture, as it had now become, picked up the pieces, with the sound of disco heavily inspiring its more pop-friendly sibling, boogie, and also much of the contemporary R&B of the decade. It was also a defining influence on house music, with the repetitiveness and the 4-to-the-floor beat being repurposed for a new crowd. And incidentally, it would later be house music that helped bring about disco's second wave. Fast forward to the end of the 90s and the conventions of disco music are being re-explored. French house, which was a combination of the sci-fi influenced space disco, the campiness of Eurodisco, and the funk inspirations of American house genres, was proving immensely popular in clubs at the time, moving away from the intensity of rave culture and towards a slicker, cooler, future-feeling sound. Artists such as Modjo, Stardust, and of course Daft Punk were pivotal acts in the genre at the time. Influenced by this, other artists such as Jamiroquai, Shakedown, Kylie Minnogue, Sophie Ellis Bextor, and Junior Senior would all release music around this time that would later be referred to as new disco, a name that has since been applied to a lot of releases in the years since. It's around the turn of the century, however, that this sound was really at its peak, with the image of disco being repurposed into a cooler, more 21st century interpretation. Where disco's first wave often had a much more live music feel to it, that is, they were often recording from live guitars, pianos, basses and drum kits and so on. Disco's second wave is defined by electronic instrumentation. The production has a far more digital, modern feel to it, as well as including new elements such as sampling, the combination of which gave many songs from this era a real nostalgic yet also futuristic feel. It's this era that has been particularly important in forming the new third wave of disco, as many of its artists grew up listening to this music. So, now that we've covered the history of how we got here, let's examine some of the characteristics of disco's third wave that make it different from its previous peaks in popularity. The first is that this is the first time in a while that we've had entire albums and records based on disco's sound. The last time we had entire disco albums being produced was really around the start of the 2000s, and while the style has been used by plenty of artists between then and now, it's mainly only been used for single releases. The only exception to this really was Random Access Memories by Daft Punk, thanks to plenty of influence from Chic member Nile Rodgers. This record, however, really stands alone. In the last few years, however, there have been lots of disco and disco-inspired albums making the rounds. These include Honey by Robyn, Very Best by Goldie Boutier, Dedicated by Carly Rae Jepsen, Roisin Machine by Roisin Murphy, Lost Girls by Bat for Lashes, Future Nostalgia by Dua Lipa, and my personal favourite, What's Your Pleasure by Jessie Ware. There certainly isn't the same volume of disco records being released compared to how it was at the end of the 70s, however there's a very good reason for that, and it's because it's been combined with other genres more than ever before. Hence, the second characteristic is that disco's third wave is more entwined with pop than ever before. Pop music as a whole is going through a real moment as we speak, with all sorts of innovations going on and a metric ton of new, successful artists driving this, especially women. Artists such as Robyn and Carly Rae Jepsen have been really interested in combining elements of disco with their own brands of electropop, whilst many more artists such as Mitski and The Weeknd have experimented with disco sound on individual tracks as part of larger albums. Much of this comes from artists' own interests, of course, but it's also a reflection of just how much music has changed since disco's early days. Whereas many of disco's most famous tracks have long run times and were often released on 12-inch vinyl, which is the largest format for a vinyl single release, the tracks in disco's third wave are noticeably shorter. It makes them easier to play on the radio and more profitable on streaming services, where it's all about the number of streams you get rather than the overall listening time. Full-on 12-inch mixes of today's disco hits are far rarer than they were even in the new disco and French house era, where vinyl versions of songs would often be used in clubs. The third characteristic is that a lot of influence and interest in the genre is coming from non-Western artists. For the past 40 years or so, music in Japan and to a lesser extent Korea and Taiwan has been really influenced by American funk and soul, such that huge scenes focused on these sounds have now existed there for decades. You ever wondered why the menu music in Japanese games like Gran Turismo and Final Fantasy and Ace Combat, or the title tracks for anime shows often sounds like American funk and soul? Well, that's because it was inspired by that kind of stuff. As these genres are stablemates of disco, it's not hard to see why interest in making disco songs has never been too far away from these East Asian music scenes. The difference now is that today, with more interconnectivity than ever before when it comes to discovering and listening to artists, we're able to connect with music scenes around the globe so much faster than ever before. It's these connections that have allowed artists like Mitski and Rina Sawayama to gain a global following, both of whom have released disco songs. The fourth characteristic is to do with the production of these records, and it's that third wave disco is a big amalgamation of all the sounds that have come before. As I mentioned earlier, the production style of disco's first wave was dominated by live instrument recording, with the production styles often putting emphasis on deep basses, shimmering string sections, and vocal styles that mixed gospel with pop and soul. This gave a lot of these tracks a very glamorous, romantic, and joyous sound, with a healthy dose of campiness in there as well. Disco's second wave, as I've also previously mentioned, was much slicker and cooler in sound thanks to the dominance of electronic instrumentation, as well as using samples to add a nostalgic feel. Much of this came about because it was how house music was being produced at the time in general, and as it was French crunch house that had helped really bring new life to the genre, these production techniques carried over. As for the production style that dominates disco's third wave, it's a big mix of everything that has come before. Many artists have returned to using live instrumentation for guitars and bass sections, whilst combining these with synths and drum machines. The production styles are also much more varied. Jessie Ware's What's Your Pleasure, for instance, has a much more restrained, stylish and classy nature to it, whilst Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia is more boppy, defined and dynamic. With so much easy access to all the material that has preceded this current wave, today's disco goes in all kinds of directions, even more so when artists only use a style for a couple of tracks and combine it with others. Less than pioneering the genre, it's more about artists putting their own spin on it and sharing their own love for these earlier records. Lastly, and perhaps the characteristic that I find most interesting of all, is that disco's third wave is a representation of how this generation interprets culture. Apologies for getting a little bit intense for just a moment, but young people today are a group of people that have been screwed over by society. Gen Z, Zillennials and Millennials, sorry for reinforcing all the stereotypes behind these terms, are all generations defined by a need to define themselves. The ideologies of Western governance, God I love saying that so much, and the political forces especially at play in the US and the UK have not represented the interests and needs of this current cohort of young people, both as they've grown up and as they've transitioned into adulthood. We also have a media more keen to brand us with these generational names and associate various tropes with each of them, quite often in a negative light. Couple that with a raging late-stage capitalism that fervently commoditizes everything and isolates anyone who doesn't want to be as vapid and soul-draining as it is, and boom, you end up with a generation that don't feel recognized or represented by society. As such, so much of this generation's identity is about doing whatever you want and making it your own, and when it comes to culture, that especially means looking to the past for inspiration. For instance, 90s and early 2000s fashion trends are really in at the moment, not just because of the 20-year cycle of fashion, but also because these styles represent a nostalgia for our childhoods and are in some ways a rejection of today's fast fashion trends. And this is also the case with music. In the UK, for instance, post-punk, a genre that first emerged 40 years ago, is currently the defining alternative music style. And that's where disco comes in. Music has always been about reinterpretation and reinvention, and a particular driving force for the pop artists of late has been to reinvent older genres for a new audience. The popularity and famousness of disco makes this an ideal choice, further reinforced by the fact that many artists will have grown up listening to this and had parents who listen to it as well. As our generation searches for its own identities, it can often gravitate towards genres that encourage feelings of nostalgia or times gone by, and the iconic imagery of disco's late 70s period offers exactly that, an era that brought together people from all walks of life in the name of dance and enjoyment. Disco too has strong resonance with black, queer and other minority groups thanks to their association with its history, and it's an appeal that continues through to this day. As today's listeners express their desire to see an ever more diverse and better represented world, music plays an essential part of that, and disco is an ideal genre with which to express that. Disco's third wave is helping to bring new love and interest to this genre and showing just how applicable it is to different music scenes and interests. It also makes me happy to see how much of this wave is being led by female, queer and non-white artists. So much of the appeal of disco back in the late 70s was that it was a unifying and equalising space for expression and entertainment. Whilst by no means perfect, 70s disco had a real balance in terms of gender equality, and it was a major achievement in the context of the social movements of the decade. And when you see pictures of the clubs that played this stuff back in the day, the dance floors are filled with people from all backgrounds and all identities, expressing themselves however they want to. That legacy is being continued today, and while none of this current wave is particularly political in its nature, the progress that it represents is so important. And that's about all I have to say about that. It's so exciting to be living through a time of so much pop innovation, especially when you consider this alongside the current hyperpop culture and all of the experimental pop artists who are really helping to drive this forward. I put together a Spotify playlist of all the songs that helped to inspire this video, and you can find the link to that in the description below. There you'll also find my smidgen of disco and funk playlist, which has my favourite songs that those genres produced back in the late 70s. Tell me what your favourite disco records are in the comments below, old or new, and I'll catch you in the next one. Outfit check, baby. Today he's rocking the oversized pattern shirt. How about that, eh? The shop's finally reopened in Wales just this week, and I've been literally frothing at the mouth waiting to get back there and spend all my money on vintage and secondhand clothes. Hence why I'm wearing this. I really wanted to make like sort of Cuban short sleeve shirts my big thing last year, but I never really got the chance because the summer was just so interrupted by fucking Rona. So we're gonna do it again this summer, and I'm hoping to kick off that trend with this. I mean, look at this thing, it's just gorgeous. Also, credit to my new light, my new ring light from eBay. Fantastic bit of kit. It's making me look gorgeous. Makes a big difference from using this sort of LED light thing that I had from IKEA, which I was previously using, which it's absolutely brilliant as an LED light, but it never stood up properly, and I just haven't got the patience to try and keep working with it, you know? I hope you're all keeping well, guys. Like, I'm in a good mood at the moment, life's on the up, I think it's fair to say, and I hope wherever you are, it's the same kind of trend and story for you.